You've heard this 1,000 times. Empaths attract narcissists because they're too loving, too giving, too open-hearted. It sounds poetic. It also sounds completely wrong. Because here's what nobody is telling you. The real reason this pattern keeps happening has nothing to do with how much love you have to give. It has everything to do with something much deeper, something Jung called the shadow. Stay with me. Let's start with the story you've probably told yourself. You're an empath. You feel deeply. You love fiercely. And somehow, again and again, you end up with someone who takes and never gives back. The internet has a very clean explanation for this. Empaths and narcissists are energetic opposites. They magnetically attract each other. It sounds profound, right? But here's the issue. That explanation is completely unfalsifiable. It can't be tested. It can't be measured. And more importantly, it doesn't actually help you change anything. So let's go deeper. Because the real answer isn't comfortable, and it's almost never talked about in empath spaces. Here's what the research actually shows. People who identify as empaths often score high on something called anxious attachment. This is a pattern where you fear abandonment, you overfunction in relationships, and you unconsciously seek out partners whose unavailability triggers your nervous system into hyperdrive. Now, is that your fault? Absolutely not. But is it your responsibility to understand? Yes, completely. Because until you understand why you're drawn to that specific kind of intensity, you'll keep calling it a spiritual connection when it's actually a trauma response. Here's where it gets really interesting. Carl Jung never used the word empath. I want to be clear about that because I see fake Jung quotes about empaths circulating online every single day. But what Jung did write about, extensively, was the concept of psychological projection. And this is the key that most empath content completely ignores. Projection in Jungian terms means this. We unconsciously cast onto other people the parts of ourselves we cannot see or accept. Now, here's the uncomfortable question. What does a narcissist actually embody? Self-centeredness, entitlement, the ability to put themselves first without apology, a refusal to shrink. And what does the typical person who calls themselves an empath struggle with? Putting themselves first, feeling entitled to their own needs, taking up space without guilt. Do you see it? Jung would say the narcissist is carrying something in their personality that the empath has buried in their shadow. The shadow, and I've mentioned this in other videos, is not your dark side in the Hollywood sense. It's simply the parts of yourself that got rejected early in life, the parts that weren't safe to express. If you grew up in a household where being assertive was dangerous, where your needs were too much, where love was conditional on how well you took care of others, then you learned to bury your self-assertion. You learned to be selfless as a survival strategy. And then you grew up and you met someone who radiates exactly the unapologetic self-focus you were forced to abandon. And something in you lit up. Not because you're weak, not because you love too much, but because your psyche recognized something it lost a long time ago. This is crazy, but it's also incredibly freeing once you understand it. Because it means the attraction is giving you information. It's pointing directly at your unlived life. Now, I need to talk about something that's going to feel a little sharp. And I say this with complete respect because I know this audience thinks deeply. The term empath, as it's used in most online spaces, has become a way to avoid a much more precise and helpful concept, codependency. This is the empath versus codependent conversation that almost nobody in this space wants to have. Here's the difference. A highly sensitive person, which is a real scientifically validated construct from Elaine Aron's research, processes sensory and emotional information more deeply than about 70% of the population. That's neurobiological, it's measurable, it's real. Codependency is something different. It's a relational pattern where your sense of self becomes organized around managing another person's emotional state, where you feel responsible for other people's feelings, where saying no feels like a moral failure, where you confuse caretaking with love. Now, can a highly sensitive person also have codependent patterns? Absolutely. In fact, it's extremely common. Because HSP children are more affected by their emotional environment. If that environment was chaotic or demanding, they often develop codependent strategies to maintain safety. But here's the problem. When we call all of that being an empath, we turn a wound into an identity. We make the coping mechanism sound like a gift, and then we wonder why the pattern keeps repeating. If you're constantly attracting narcissistic partners, and I say this with complete care, the most useful question is not, why do narcissists target me? The most useful question is, what am I getting from this dynamic? Because you are getting something. Maybe it's a sense of purpose. Maybe it's the familiar feeling of earning love. Maybe it's the high of being needed. None of that makes you broken, but it does make it worth examining. The reality is, real depth psychology asks hard questions, and the hard question here is whether the identity of empath is sometimes functioning as protection from seeing the codependency underneath. There's an archetype Jung wrote about that I think maps perfectly onto this dynamic: the wounded healer. In Greek mythology, Chiron was a centaur who was struck by a poisoned arrow he could never heal. But because of that wound, he became the greatest healer in the ancient world. Jung used this myth to describe a specific psychological pattern. The person who is most drawn to healing others is often the one most urgently in need of their own healing. Now, that's not a criticism. That's an incredibly human thing. But here's where it connects to the narcissist pattern. Many people who identify as empaths are unconsciously trying to heal their original wound through their romantic relationships. Maybe you had a parent who was emotionally unavailable or volatile, or someone whose love felt conditional on your performance. And somewhere in your nervous system, a belief got encoded. If I'm loving enough, patient enough, understanding enough, I can finally reach them. And when I do, it will mean I'm finally enough. So when you meet someone with narcissistic traits, someone who is emotionally unavailable, who runs hot and cold, who gives you just enough to keep you trying, your nervous system doesn't say, danger. It says, familiar. It says, this is where I can finally win. That's not a character flaw. That's a nervous system doing exactly what it was trained to do. But, and this is the crucial part, recognizing that pattern is the beginning of real individuation. Jung's whole life project was this: become conscious of the forces that are running you unconsciously. The moment you see the wounded healer pattern in yourself, you stop being its victim. You can start asking, am I choosing this person because I genuinely love them, or because they activate my oldest wound? So what's the solution? Let me give you something concrete. Step 1. Stop romanticizing intensity. The empath-narcissist relationship almost always begins with overwhelming chemistry. That electric feeling of being truly seen. The sense that this person understands you on a soul level. Here's the psychological truth about that. Intense early connection is very often a trauma bond forming, not love deepening. A person with narcissistic traits is extremely skilled, often unconsciously, at mirroring. They reflect you back to yourself in a way that feels extraordinarily intimate. But they're not seeing you, they're showing you your own reflection. And when that reflection disappears, when the mask shifts, the pain is devastating because it feels like losing something profound. But what you lost was a projection, not a person. Step number 2, reclaim your shadow. Remember what I said earlier, the narcissist often carries qualities you've buried: self-assertion, entitlement to your own needs, the ability to disappoint people without collapsing. The shadow work here is not to become narcissistic, obviously. It's to consciously integrate those qualities in healthy form. Start asking yourself, where am I allowed to put myself first? Where am I allowed to say no without explaining myself? Where am I allowed to take up space? Because when you stop needing someone else to carry those qualities for you, their pull on you begins to dissolve. This is why shadow work is not just journaling exercises. It's not aesthetic. It's the actual psychological mechanism by which the pattern breaks. Step number 3, learn the difference between empathy and self-erasure. Seriously speaking, empathy is a capacity. It means you can feel into another person's experience. Self-erasure is a behavior. It means you systematically ignore your own experience to accommodate someone else's. Those are not the same thing, and for many people who identify as empaths, what they're actually doing in relationship is self-erasure. Overall background tone: calm, grounded, intelligent, compassionate, authoritative. Real empathy includes empathy for yourself. It includes the ability to say, I understand you're in pain, and I'm not available to absorb it. When you develop that capacity, when your empathy becomes boundaried, you stop being the perfect target. Not because you've become loving, but because you've become more whole. If this video made you think differently about this pattern, that's the whole point. Drop a comment below and tell me, did you recognize the wounded healer in yourself? I genuinely want to know. And if you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button, because next week we're going deeper into shadow work and what it actually looks like to reclaim the parts of yourself you abandoned. I'll see you there.